The story opens on a moonlit night, a thin mist clinging to the ground. Standing before us is the Holloway Asylum, abandoned for decades, but with a reputation that has only grown darker with time. The building looms in the darkness, its broken windows like hollow eyes, surrounded by dense, whispering trees. Our protagonist, Ethan, a young, skeptical urban explorer, is filming for his YouTube channel, hoping to debunk the asylum's ghost stories and draw in more views. Ethan chuckles nervously into the camera. All right, guys, tonight we're breaking into the legendary Holloway Asylum. Locals say it's cursed, but we'll see about that. Ethan steps through the main gate, its rusty metal creaking loudly. As he enters the main hall, his flashlight sweeps across the walls, peeling paint revealing long-forgotten graffiti. An unsettling silence fills the room. Ethan shrugs it off and presses forward, narrating his movements into the camera to build suspense. Then, a faint sound, a shuffling from down the hall. Ethan freezes, his breath catching, but convinces himself it's just an animal. He laughs to himself. Jumping at shadows already, huh? But the laughter doesn't quite reach his eyes. The camera pans to a long hallway lined with old hospital beds, each covered with a thin layer of dust, like skeletal remains. Ethan shines his light into one of the rooms and gasps, catching the faint outline of a shadow sitting on a bed. Hello? He calls out, but the shadow remains motionless. Slowly he walks closer, and as his flashlight falls fully on the bed, he realizes there's nothing there. His laughter is shaky, his confidence faltering. Then, a loud clang echoes from the room next door. His camera catches a glimpse of a figure darting past the doorway. Heart pounding, Ethan approaches cautiously, whispering to his audience, "I'm not alone here." But as he turns the corner, he finds only emptiness. Ethan stumbles upon the asylum records scattered across the floor. Curious, he flips through them, finding disturbing notes about a patient who claimed to speak with shadows and know the dead. He feels the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he reads the patient's final note. They're here. They've always been here. Suddenly, his camera catches movement, a reflection in the cracked glass of the window, just over his shoulder. It's a face, pale and staring directly at him. He spins around and there's no one there. "Okay, that's enough games," he mutters, trying to keep the fear from his voice. Ethan makes his way to what was once the doctor's office. Inside, he finds an old wheelchair in the center of the room, as though waiting for him. He approaches it cautiously, brushing his hand along the armrest when, suddenly, the wheelchair jolts, moving on its own across the floor. The room's temperature plummets, and Ethan's breath becomes visible. He feels an icy touch on his shoulder. Panicked, he whirls around, but once again, he's alone. His flashlight flickers and goes out. The camera catches the faint whisper of a voice echoing, "They're watching you." Ethan regains his composure, chalking everything up to faulty wiring and old pipes. "Nothing a little fixing up wouldn't solve," he mutters, trying to sound brave. He stumbles upon an old operating room, complete with rusty scalpels and a gurney stained with what looks suspiciously like dried blood. The faint echo of surgical instruments clinking together fills the air, though nothing moves. The door suddenly slams shut behind him, and a violent banging sound reverberates through the room as though something or someone is trying to get in. He huddles in a corner, breathing heavily. Suddenly, a sharp pain shoots through his arm, and he looks down to see thin scratches forming, as though unseen nails are clawing at him. A terrified scream erupts from his throat, but no one hears it. Desperate to leave, Ethan heads down a narrow staircase leading him into the morgue. The room is colder than the rest of the asylum. Rows of empty drawers line the walls, each with a nameplate, patients who were never picked up by family. The silence is overwhelming, but then one drawer slowly begins to open. A hand, pale, bony, and reaching, emerges, clawing its way out. Ethan stumbles backward, only to see more hands reaching from other drawers, their skeletal fingers twitching and grabbing at the air. He makes a break for the stairs, but his flashlight catches another figure standing at the top, blocking his way, a doctor, or what once was a doctor. Its hollow eyes stare at him, and a twisted smile stretches across its decayed face. "You shouldn't be here," it hisses. In sheer panic, Ethan turns and runs deeper into the asylum, hearing footsteps echoing behind him. The walls close in, the building itself seeming to breathe. He ends up in a patient's room, the same one he saw in the records, where the patient claimed to speak with shadows. As he shines his flashlight around, the shadows on the walls start moving, slithering across the room and surrounding him. Faces begin to form within the shadows, distorted, sorrowful, their mouths moving but making no sound. Then, one shadow breaks free, lunging at Ethan. He falls to the floor, dropping his camera, which catches the moment as his flashlight goes out, leaving the screen in total darkness. The last thing we hear is his scream, raw and terrified, echoing through the asylum.
It started with a phone call. It was 3:18 a.m. when the shrill ring shattered the suffocating silence of my bedroom. Heart thudding in my chest, I reached for my phone, clumsy with sleep, and squinted at the screen. Unknown caller? It read in a pale blue glow. Hello? I croaked into the receiver. Static answered me first, a hiss that crackled and faded. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a whisper slithered through the line, dry and rasping. Come home, it said, the words brittle like autumn leaves breaking underfoot. The line went dead. I sat there, phone still pressed against my ear, trying to shake the cold dread that wrapped around my ribs. My apartment was a fortress of shadows, moonlight carving pale stripes across my floor, and the air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalked it up to a prank, or maybe a wrong number, and set my phone back on the nightstand. That was when the knocking started. 3 deliberate raps on my bedroom door. My breath hitched. I knew for a fact that I had locked all my doors. My studio apartment was tiny, an open living area with a small attached bathroom, no room for an intruder to hide. Is someone there? I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. Silence pressed in. The darkness felt sharper, more aware, as if something unseen was holding its breath. I fumbled for my bedside lamp, my fingers trembling. When the light flared to life, it bathed the room in a warm, artificial glow. Nothing. The door was closed, just as I'd left it. I let out a shaky laugh, but my relief was short-lived. Behind me, from the bathroom, I heard a soft, dragging sound, like wet fabric being pulled across the floor. I turned slowly, my mouth dry, and stared at the narrow gap under the bathroom door. Was it my imagination, or did the darkness seem to bleed out, seeping across the floorboards? I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. It was more for comfort than for actual self-defense, but it made me feel marginally braver. I crept toward the bathroom door, each footstep echoing too loudly. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by the faint drip of the faucet. I was sure I'd turned the water off before going to bed. The door swung open before I touched it. I stumbled back, barely managing to keep a grip on the bat. The bathroom light flickered, buzzing in a desperate rhythm. My reflection in the mirror was pale, wide-eyed, but there was something wrong. Something horribly, inexplicably wrong. My reflection wasn't moving the way I was. It stared back, but its lips curved into a grin I wasn't wearing. It lifted a hand, and so did I, but not in unison. It was as if my reflection had been waiting for me to notice before it decided to play along. Then it spoke, but its mouth didn't move. The words came from right behind me. Come home, it said, in the same brittle whisper as the phone call. I spun around, swinging the bat. It sliced through empty air. No one was there. The bathroom light steadied, shining harshly on my trembling hands. The mirror now showed only my terrified reflection, obedient and silent. Something clattered in the kitchen, a sound so loud that I screamed. I bolted out of the bathroom, heart hammering in my throat. The kitchen was a mess, drawers yanked open, utensils scattered across the floor. The refrigerator door swung open lazily, and all the lights in the apartment flickered. I could feel a presence then, something cold and ancient pressing down on the walls. The air smelled wrong, sharp and metallic, like blood. I backed up until I hit the wall, the bat now useless weight in my grip. My phone buzzed, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped the bat. I snatched it up, my hands shaking. Another call. Unknown caller. My gut twisted, but I accepted the call, clutching the phone to my ear. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The line hissed with static. Then, beneath the noise, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A slow, deliberate scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from the front door. "I'm already inside," the whisper said, closer this time, almost in my ear. My vision swam. There was no one in the apartment with me. There couldn't be. But the knocking came again, a frantic, desperate pounding that rattled the door on its hinges. I dropped the phone and scrambled backward. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, frozen with terror. The door creaked open. I could only watch as something impossible stepped into view. It looked like me, but wrong. Its limbs slightly too long, its eyes too bright, its smile too wide. It walked toward me, head cocked at an unnatural angle, and its mouth opened. "Come home," it whispered, and then, grinning, it lunged. Everything went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. The apartment was pristine. No scattered utensils, no open drawers. My phone sat peacefully on the nightstand, but when I checked the screen, there was a single message waiting for me. "Welcome home." I moved out the next day, but no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I still hear it. Whispering, knocking, waiting. My reflection is never quite right anymore, and some nights I swear I hear it dragging itself across the floor, always closer, always coming.
I remember the day it started, small, sharp, and unforgettable, like a puncture wound you don't notice until it bleeds. Late October had settled into the bones of our small New England town, bringing with it a bitter chill and a sky the color of old bruises. I'd just moved into the house on Maple Street, a Victorian relic with peeling blue paint and a wraparound porch choked by ivy. Its windows like watchful, dead eyes. "She's got character," my mother had insisted, smiling that tight, hopeful smile she used whenever she knew I was afraid. But character had its price, and that night, as I lay alone in the sagging master bedroom, character felt more like a thin veil over something, hungry. The first noise came at midnight, slithering through the darkness. I froze, fingers suspended over the spine of my book. It was faint at first, a scratching sound, almost playful, like something small testing its claws against the beams overhead. I told myself it was a rat or a squirrel making a mental note to buy traps, but deep down, I already knew. The second noise came closer, a deliberate creak as if someone had shifted their weight in the hallway outside my door. My heart jackknifed in my chest, and I lay still, ears straining, waiting. When the silence returned, it was thick, oppressive, the kind that has a pulse of its own. The next day, I shrugged it off as nerves. The house was old, I reasoned, and old houses groan. But reasoning only takes you so far, and by evening, as twilight painted the walls in ghostly shades of gray, I was still on edge. I unpacked boxes with jittery hands, trying to drown out my unease with chores. My phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "How's life in the haunted house?" I laughed, a hollow, brittle sound, and turned back to rinse a glass in the kitchen sink. That's when I heard it, a crash so sudden and violent it shattered the fragile bubble of safety I'd constructed around myself. The pantry door had slammed open as if punched from the inside. I spun around, the glass slipping from my hand and smashing into the sink. Shards bit into my bare feet and bright red blood pooled across the cracked tiles. My breath came in ragged gasps as I grabbed a towel, pressing it to my foot. The pantry door swung slightly, almost mockingly, and I tried to laugh off the fear that curled in my gut. But laughter only goes so far when you know, truly know, that something is wrong. The third night was a war of attrition, with fear as my opponent. I barricaded the pantry door with a heavy chair, feeling foolish but strangely triumphant. By midnight, the house had turned into a living entity, breathing, creaking, whispering secrets only I could hear. Sleep came in fits and starts, pulling me under only to toss me back into waking nightmares. That's when the whispering began. Faint at first, like water running over stones, unintelligible but insistent. I lay paralyzed, every muscle locked. It grew louder, clearer, until I could make out a woman's voice, low and lilting.
Are you listening?
My blood turned to ice. The floorboards outside my room groaned under an invisible weight, something pacing slowly, tauntingly. I turned toward the door, expecting to see a shadow slipping under the frame. But there was only darkness, until the handle twisted, rattling violently. I clamped a hand over my mouth, muffling a scream. It rattled again and then stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had lost interest. But then came the scraping, slow, dragging, nails drawn across wood, and then a giggle, high-pitched, childlike, the kind that doesn't belong in the dead of night. The next day, I begged Maggie to come over. "You're spooked," she said, trying to sound confident. But her eyes betrayed her fear. We stayed up that night, armed with flashlights and half a bottle of whiskey, flinching at every groan of the house. Midnight crept in, and with it came the sobbing. It started in the walls, low and mournful, growing into heart-wrenching wails. Maggie gripped my arm, her knuckles white. "Tell me you hear that," I whispered. She nodded, her face as pale as moonlight. The sobbing led us to the attic hatch at the end of the hall. With shaking hands, Maggie reached for the cord. The ladder unfurled, slamming down with a jarring thud. We both jumped, and my flashlight beam wobbled as I pointed it into the yawning blackness above. Something thumped onto the landing. A dusty music box, its hinges rusted, the lid cracked open. A warped, broken lullaby spilled from it, sweet but dissonant, each note like a mocking laugh. The attic hatch slammed shut, trapping us in the dark. The music box played louder, faster. Maggie screamed, but her voice died in my ears as the whisper came again, so close I could feel the breath on my skin.
Are you listening?
My flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering out. The house seemed to inhale around us, shadows pressing in, and I understood. It wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by a presence far more ancient, far more aware. The house had been waiting, and now that we were here, it wouldn't let us go.
Isn't it funny how every school has its own ghost stories, and they're always eerily believable, like the tale of the midnight class? Some older kid, who probably should have been focusing on their own homework, spread the rumor. A hidden class that's impossible to enroll in, but can trap you if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like anyone else, I brushed it off, chalking it up to another way to freak out the freshmen, or make homecoming week a little creepier. But then, one late Friday, I got more than I bargained for. It was homecoming season, so I'd stayed after school to finish decorating the gym. By the time I was done, the place was empty, dark, and eerily silent, with the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. As I was leaving, my path down the empty hall was interrupted by a strange, faint sound. Laughter. Not the usual laughter you'd expect from rowdy classmates, but something lower, almost whispered, and wrong. I tried to shake it off, but my heart was beating like I'd just run a mile. Trying to laugh it off, barely. I headed for my locker, but as I was fiddling with the lock, our ancient PA system crackled to life, spitting out static. Then came the announcement. All students report to room 309. Repeat, all students report to room 309. A chill shot down my spine. Room 309. 3 years at that school, and I knew there was no room 309. Must be a prank, I thought. But then I spotted faint scuff marks along the hall floor, like something heavy had been dragged. Against all logic, I found myself moving toward them, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The marks led me to the 3rd floor, the part of the school that's practically a ghost town after hours. And, wouldn't you know it, there at the far end was a door, slightly open, with a plaque that read, Room 309. My rational side was screaming, turn around and go home. But the other part, the curious part that keeps us watching scary movies, even after we know it's a bad idea, pushed me forward. The door creaked shut behind me, trapping me in a room that was as cold and eerie as a winter graveyard. The place was pitch dark, except for some faint moonlight casting weird shadows. That's when I saw them, rows of desks, each occupied by a figure slumped over, dressed in faded uniforms from who knows when. They looked more like ghosts than students, with their pale, sunken faces and blank stares. The air felt heavy, thick, with the smell of dust and rot. My heart pounded as I noticed the teacher, a tall figure shrouded in shadows, standing at the front. He turned, glancing at an old, yellowed attendance sheet. "Ah, we have a new student," he drawled, his voice an unnerving mix of a whisper and a hiss. "Welcome to the midnight class. I hope you're ready to learn forever." Panic hit me like a slap to the face, and I lunged for the door, but it was locked tight. The students all began turning their heads to stare at me, eyes hollow, gazes piercing. I could feel them, pulling me into their ranks. Then I heard a faint voice from the back. "You have to get out now while he's distracted," whispered a girl whose face was hidden beneath matted hair. She looked as if she'd been there for decades. "When he writes on the board, he loses focus. That's your only chance." The teacher turned to the chalkboard, his bony fingers scratching symbols that made my head spin. The sound was worse than nails on a chalkboard. A nightmare turned to life. Now or never, I thought, inching my way toward the door, not daring to breathe too loud. I took one last look over my shoulder and saw the teacher, his face contorted and half-faded, watching me. "You'll be back," he hissed. "Everyone comes back." With a desperate twist, the door flung open, and I bolted. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping the fresh night air, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I turned back to look, I saw it, the faint glow of a light in that 3rd floor window, a shadow standing still, watching. The next day, I told my friends. Of course, no one believed me. Room 309 wasn't supposed to exist, they reminded me. Just a story. But as I looked down, I saw them. Bruises on my wrist, as if skeletal fingers had gripped me tightly. Since that night, I haven't been able to escape the dreams. Every night, I hear the sound of chalk scraping, echoing down dark halls, a constant reminder. I know, deep down, that one day I'll find myself back in room 309. Because once you enter the midnight class, you never really leave. And now, I keep asking myself, who's going to stumble into it next?
There's something spine-chilling about a stormy night in an empty gym, isn't there? The kind of night where the world feels paused, like you're in a place that time forgot. This was exactly the vibe the night our big basketball game got called off. Picture this: a deserted gym, rain pounding the roof in a steady, thunderous rhythm, like the heartbeat of some unseen giant. Everyone else had already filtered out, eager to get home before the storm truly settled in. But not us. Nope. Me, Jace, and Liv, the reluctant trio, were left behind to clean up. We could have just bolted, but we figured we'd show some team spirit. Or, let's be honest, Coach guilted us into it before he slipped out the door, probably hoping to dodge the downpour. So there we were, sweeping up popcorn kernels and picking up stray soda cups, grumbling about missed games and canceled plans. I'd almost lulled myself into a cleaning groove when something caught my eye. A basketball all alone in the far corner, almost swallowed by the shadows. It was as if it had rolled there on its own, waiting. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's just a basketball. Don't be dramatic. But something felt off. Call it intuition, call it nerves from the storm. Either way, I walked over and picked it up. And wow, let me tell you, this ball was ice cold. Like, straight from the Arctic cold. I don't mean chilly or just cooler than expected. It felt like I'd yanked it out of a freezer. I looked around, half expecting Jace to pop out with some practical joke up his sleeve, but he and Liv were on the other side of the court, chatting like nothing was wrong. A gust of wind made the gym doors shudder, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, just soft enough that it could have been the wind, but close enough to send goosebumps racing up my arms. Alright, very funny guys, I muttered, rolling my eyes. But my voice sounded tiny in the empty gym, swallowed up by the silence that felt almost alive. That's when a flash of lightning lit up the space, bright enough to turn the bleachers into stark black shadows. And there, on the top row, slouched like he'd been watching all night, was a figure. He looked right at me, and then, as quickly as the light had come, it was gone, plunging the gym back into darkness. My heart felt like it was trying to leap out of my chest. I told myself it was just a shadow, a weird after image from the flash of lightning. But my gut wasn't buying it. My mind started racing. Every ghost story and horror movie I'd ever seen bubbling to the surface. I tried to explain it to Jace and Liv, but they just shrugged. Come on, let's just finish up and get out of here. Liv laughed, though I noticed her voice was shaky. She glanced around the gym, too, her forced smile slipping a little. At least I wasn't the only one who felt it. Back to sweeping, back to focusing on anything but the weirdness around us, right? Wrong, because just as I tried to shake off the heebie-jeebies, the scoreboard, dead all night, suddenly blinked to life. Numbers glowed bright red, 6-6. Our heads snapped up, all three of us staring at that scoreboard. Jace, usually the fearless jokester, muttered, "That's creepy." But before we could process it, the scoreboard buzzer went off, loud enough to make us all jump. And then, because things clearly weren't weird enough, the gym lights started flickering, casting long, warped shadows that felt like they were reaching for us. Then came the sound that sent my pulse racing, a faint, unmistakable squeak. At first, it was just a whisper of rubber against the court, but it got louder, closer, like someone or something was moving toward us. I turned to the court, expecting, well, I don't know what I was expecting, but what I saw wasn't it. There, in the flickering light, were shadows that looked like players. Real, solid figures wearing vintage jerseys, their faces twisted into expressions that sent a shiver down my spine. And one of them, a tall guy with hollow eyes, drifted closer, locking his gaze on me. Recognition hit me like a punch. This was Evan Michaels. His face was everywhere in our school's trophy case, one of the most legendary players our team had ever known. Evan had collapsed on that very court decades ago, right in the middle of a game. The story went that his heart had given out, that he died mid-play with his team ahead by 6 points. But in the confusion, the opposing team had tied the game. The buzzer had glitched, refusing to end the game properly. Ever since, people whispered that his spirit was still around, waiting for a finish. Love's voice was barely a whisper. Do you think he wants us to finish the game? She looked like she'd seen a ghost, which, honestly, I guess she had. Before we could think twice, the scoreboard flashed again, showing 6-6, and a countdown clock appeared, ticking down from 30 seconds. The message was clear: play, or who knows. With an unspoken agreement, we each grabbed a basketball and took our positions. As soon as we moved, the ghostly players lined up against us, their hollow eyes locking onto ours. The buzzer sounded, and the game began. We were playing for real, adrenaline fueling every move. Every basket we scored seemed to fade a figure on the court, their forms flickering like they were running out of steam. It was like they were chasing one last chance to relive their glory days. With just seconds left, I spotted an opening and threw the final shot. Everything slowed down as the ball sailed through the air, and finally swished through the net. The scoreboard flashed 7-6 just as the buzzer blared one last time. Silence fell, and one by one, the ghostly players faded, their faces softening as if finally at peace. Evan lingered for a moment longer, giving us a look of gratitude before he, too, vanished. The gym felt lighter, warmer, as if whatever presence had been there had lifted. We didn't say a word as we walked out, the memory of that night sealed in our minds. But sometimes, on stormy nights, I think I can still hear the faint squeak of sneakers echoing in the halls. Evan's way of reminding us that he's still there, waiting, perhaps, for another game.
It all started with a dare. Classic. After school, we were talking about the creepy, locked-up science lab in the basement. According to rumor, that lab used to be where Project Epsilon went down back in the 80s. What it involved, no one really knew. The teachers clammed up at any mention of it, and the older staff practically sprinted away from the topic. Naturally, my best friend Dylan saw the opportunity to mess with me. "Bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes down there, Sam," he said, grinning like a Cheshire cat. I tried to brush it off, but my pride got the better of me. So that Friday night, after everyone left, I found myself creeping down the stairs, which groaned under every step as if they were warning me to turn back. The basement lights barely worked, buzzing and flickering like a horror movie cliché, casting these long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach out. And there it was, the door to the old lab, slightly open, just waiting for me, like it knew I'd show up. Inside, it was like time had stopped. Everything was layered in thick dust, beakers and tubes scattered across the tables, and an eerie smell hung in the air, like old chemicals and something worse. I turned on my phone flashlight, the dim beam only adding to the creepiness. Just as I stepped further in, I heard the door creak shut behind me. I spun around and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Fantastic. I was locked in. My heart pounded, but I wasn't about to let a locked door or some old ghost story get to me. Yet, as I scanned the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was there with me. Then I saw it. A notebook lying open on one of the desks, covered in dust, but with Project Epsilon barely legible on the cover. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside were these half-faded notes, strange diagrams, complex equations, and hastily scrawled sentences. One phrase stood out, chilling me to the core. Subject shows signs of self-awareness. Uncontrollable, hostile response when stimulated. I felt my throat tighten. Hostile? What kind of subject? A metallic clang echoed from the corner, and I swung my flashlight toward the sound. A cage stood there, rusted and twisted, with something shadowy inside, hunched and silent. My blood ran cold. The figure moved, unfolding itself until it loomed taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its form was dark and shifting, like it was only half there, flickering in and out. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. A whisper drifted through the room, brushing against my ear. "Why did you come here?" I felt my breath catch. It was closer now, a soft but chilling voice saying, "I've been waiting for someone." A burst of panic flooded me, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a desk. Beakers crashed to the floor, the sound jarring, but the figure just tilted its head, watching me like I was a bug under a microscope. I scanned the room desperately and spotted a door at the back, barely visible behind a stack of old boxes. My only chance. I bolted for it, shoving boxes aside as the scrape of metal like claws against concrete, followed me. I wrenched open the door and slipped into a pitch-black hallway. Somewhere behind me, the creature was moving, its claws scraping along as it closed in. My heart hammered as I ran, only to feel something ice-cold wrap around my ankle, yanking me to the ground. I hit the floor, stunned, and turned to see its long, bony fingers gripping me, ending in razor-sharp points. Scrambling, I grabbed the first thing my hand landed on, a chunk of metal, and swung it at the creature's hand. It shrieked, recoiling, and I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back as I tore down the hall. A faint light marked an exit at the end, and I practically threw myself against the door, crashing into the cool night air. Shaking, I glanced down at my wrist. There, like a dark bruise, was a twisted handprint burned into my skin. When I told my friends, they laughed, thinking I'd let my imagination run wild. I rolled up my sleeve to show them the mark, but it was gone, vanished like it had never been there. They didn't believe a word, of course, and I almost convinced myself it was just a nightmare. But that night, lying in bed, I heard it again, the faintest whisper creeping into my ear like a slithering fog. I've been waiting for someone. And as I opened my eyes, there it was, standing in the corner of my room, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I lay frozen, every muscle tensed, barely daring to breathe. The figure was clearer now than in the lab, its form somehow both shadowy and solid. Those hollow eyes stared with an intensity that went beyond anything human, as if it was reaching into me, trying to pull something out. My mouth went dry as I forced myself to look away, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge it, it might just vanish. But when I opened my eyes again, it was closer. Now, only a few feet away, I could see the faint outlines of its face, an expression twisted in something between anger and hunger. It tilted its head, almost curiously, as though studying my fear, savoring it. "You let me out," it whispered, its voice cold as ice. "I've been waiting, and now I'm free." I wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped in my throat. Instead, I scrambled out of bed, my feet hitting the floor with a thud. I stumbled back, eyes fixed on the figure. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it faded, like smoke dissipating into the air. The room fell silent, but the feeling of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I was a wreck. I could hardly look at my friends without wanting to blurt everything out, but I knew they'd just laugh it off again. Yet the memory of that figure, those hollow eyes, stayed with me, burned into my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still with me, hiding just beyond sight, waiting.
It started with the knocking. 3 precise raps on the back door of my apartment. Always at 2:47 a.m. Every night for the past 2 weeks. I live on the 3rd floor, mind you, with no balcony, no fire escape, and no way for anyone to even reach that door. But like clockwork, the knocking came, so regular and relentless that I stopped bothering to sleep. I'm a journalist. My job thrives on skepticism and logic, but even I was starting to crack. I couldn't brush off what was happening. The first night, I thought it was a prank. By the 5th night, the air in my apartment seemed to buzz with tension, and the shadows in the corners felt deeper, heavier. The 9th night, I recorded it. My phone camera shook in my hand as I filmed the empty door, whispering curses to keep myself calm. When the knocking started, 3 perfectly spaced knocks, I could see the door tremble, as if someone stood right behind it. But when I threw it open, nothing was there. Just the wind. Just the night. I played the recording back later, hoping to find something, an explanation. But what I heard was a nightmare, wrapped in static. A voice, thin and broken, whispering.
Let me in.
2 weeks in, sleep deprivation painted my days in a surreal haze. Everything had a wrongness to it, a creeping distortion that made the world around me feel fragile. I started catching glimpses of things in mirrors that didn't belong. My reflection lagged behind me by a fraction of a second, or so I thought. Sometimes when I passed the bathroom, the mirror inside seemed too bright, as if a second sun had ignited on the other side. But it was last night that broke me. The knocking came again, like an old friend. 2:47 a.m., sharp. I sat up in bed, heart thudding, gripping the baseball bat I had taken to sleeping with. The tension in the air was suffocating, and something in the shadows was watching me. I could feel its gaze creeping over my skin, studying me like a hunter, savoring a cornered prey. I forced myself out of bed. This time, I wouldn't hide under the covers. I approached the door, my bare feet slapping against the cold wood of the floor. The knocking came again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was coming from the inside of the apartment. Swallowing hard, I raised the bat, my knuckles white with fear, and yanked open the door. Nothing. Just the vacant moonlit city sprawled beyond the threshold. That's when I heard it. A creak behind me, a floorboard in the hallway. I spun around, and there she was. A little girl, no older than 6, standing at the end of the hallway. Her skin was paper pale, her dress torn and stained with something dark. Her head was tilted too far to the side, like someone had snapped her neck. And her eyes, God, her eyes were black holes, empty of life but full of hunger. She smiled, and her voice was the same one from the recording, a whisper leaking from shattered lungs.
Let me in.
She begged, though her smile grew wider, stretching into something that no human face should be able to manage. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The bat clattered uselessly to the floor. The hallway light sputtered, plunging everything into a flickering nightmare. When the light came back, the girl was gone. But the room wasn't empty. The shadows had moved. They had gathered, coiling like living smoke in the corners of the room. They twisted, stretched, forming shapes that almost resembled human figures, their mouths gaping wide as though to scream. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, all at once, the room fell silent. The air turned cold, so bitterly cold that frost began to spread over the walls. The shapes in the shadows receded, melting back into the ordinary darkness. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. This morning, I packed a bag and ran. I'm writing this from a cheap motel 5 miles out of town, the kind of place that smells like stale cigarettes and regret. I thought I was safe here, that putting distance between me and that cursed apartment might break the spell. But tonight, at 2:47 a.m., it came back. 3 sharp knocks. But this time, they weren't coming from the door. They came from the mirror. The surface rippled like water, and her hand pressed against the glass, pale and bruised. She tilted her head, the same grotesque angle, her black eyes boring into mine.
Let me in.
She whispered, a plea and a command, all at once. Now I sit here, waiting, my fingers trembling as I type. The motel room is getting colder, and the shadows are growing long again. I know she's coming. The mirror has started to crack, hairline fractures spidering across the glass. When it shatters, I think she'll be free. I don't know if I'll live to tell you what happens next.
The first time I came to Shallow Hills, it was because of a dare. I was 13, cocky and stupid, and the world felt like a playground built just for me. Back then, Shallow Hills was just a half-abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of our sleepy town, an expanse of rolling land where the dead lay in shallow graves that time and erosion kept pushing upward, so it wasn't unusual to see bone-white shards poking out of the soil. Everyone knew not to go there after sunset. The air itself felt different, thicker, heavy with some sour scent that burned the back of your throat. The legends said that Shallow Hills wasn't just cursed, it was hungry. I didn't believe in ghost stories, of course, but, well, I do now. It started on a humid July evening. My best friend Mason dared me to go, and our other friends circled around, jeering and laughing. The bet was simple: stay in Shallow Hills for an hour, then come back with proof. I picked up my dad's old hunting knife, strapped it to my belt for courage, and headed out. Mason trailing a few steps behind to make sure I didn't chicken out. The first thing that struck me was the silence. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustle of wind through the weeds. Just stillness, like the whole place was holding its breath. I was halfway through the graveyard when I felt it. A faint thumping under my feet, almost like the heartbeat of something enormous, slumbering just beneath the earth. I paused, heart pounding. Mason had already retreated to the road, a safe distance away. "How much longer?" I yelled back to him, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. 50 minutes, he called out, voice mocking but nervous. 50 minutes, easy. Except, as I stood there, the heartbeat-like thumping grew louder. I tried to laugh it off, but that laugh dried up in my throat when I felt a cold draft against the back of my neck. I whirled around, gripping the knife tight. I stepped past tilted headstones, some with names scratched out, others completely blank. There was that heartbeat thump again, vibrating under my soles, growing more frantic the deeper I went. I stumbled, my foot sinking into what felt like mud. But when I looked down, I realized it wasn't mud at all. A hand, decaying and gnarled, its fingers curled around my ankle, dragging me down. The grip was ice cold, strength of the dead behind it. I hacked at the wrist with my knife, the blade slicing through dry sinew and bone. The hand released me, but not before those rotten, dirt-caked fingers scraped against my skin, leaving deep welts. I scrambled back, only to hear more rustling. More hands bursting from graves, clawing their way to the surface. Then came the whispers, 100 of them all around me.
Beneath the hills, we are never still.
They were waking up, all of them. Grotesque figures, faces eaten away by time, clambered out of shallow pits, eyes empty sockets that wept something black and oily. I stumbled back, feeling for anything, any way out. The knife slipped from my hand, skidding across the dirt. I turned to run, but standing before me was the woman from the locket, only now she was very much real. Her mouth split open in that grotesque grin, stretching wider and wider until I could hear her jawbone cracking. She whispered again, this time in a voice that drilled into my brain.
You shouldn't have woken us.
She lunged, and everything went black. When I came to, it was morning. I was lying at the edge of Shallow Hills, Mason shaking me awake, his face pale as death. I thought you were gone, he said, voice cracking. You were just lying here, eyes open but not seeing anything. I didn't tell him about the whispers, or the woman, or the graves that had shifted, the dirt freshly disturbed. But as I walked away, I swore I felt eyes on me, dozens of them, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. The welts on my ankle never faded, and at night, sometimes, I still hear that heartbeat, thumping, thumping, as if something buried just beneath the shallow hills is waiting for me to come back.
I always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the world seemed to melt away, leaving only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp, untainted air. Nature was my refuge, my escape from the clamor of city life. So, when my friend Marco suggested we spend a weekend hiking through Blackwater National Park, I was the first to agree. We started at dawn, our backpacks full of supplies and our spirits high. The trail was rough, winding deeper into the park, away from civilization. Towering pines loomed overhead, their needles whispering in the breeze. Marco was ahead, laughing and teasing me about how out of shape I was. He always seemed to be laughing. But as the morning sun climbed higher, something changed. The woods grew silent, oppressively so. It wasn't the usual serene stillness of nature. No, this was the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums, the kind that feels wrong. Even Marco's laughter died down as he too seemed to sense it. Around noon, we stopped to eat. Marco checked the map, his forehead creased. "We should have crossed a creek by now," he murmured. The trail markers we'd been following had disappeared somewhere along the way, and now everything looked the same, an endless sprawl of trees and undergrowth. "Don't worry about it," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll backtrack if we have to." But the forest didn't seem to like that idea. The sky darkened, clouds creeping in from nowhere, and the temperature dropped fast. We packed up quickly, a nervous energy building between us. As we continued, I felt a creeping sense of unease. The trees seemed closer, like they were leaning in to eavesdrop on our panic. And that's when we heard it. A distant, echoing scream. High-pitched and unnatural, it sounded nothing like an animal. Marco froze, his face pale. "Probably just the wind," I said, though even I didn't believe that. We walked faster, my heart thudding with each step. An hour passed, then another, and the trail still refused to reappear. My phone had no signal, the battery draining faster than it should have. Marco tried to joke, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The woods seemed darker, and I started noticing things, shapes in the periphery of my vision, pale glimmers that would vanish as soon as I turned to look. "Did you hear that?" Marco whispered, stopping abruptly. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. Just our ragged breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. "I think we're being followed," he said, his eyes darting around. We started moving again, more cautiously. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and then we found the footprints. They were human, deep impressions in the muddy ground. But there was something off about them. The toes were elongated, twisted like claws, and the stride was unnaturally long. Worse, the prints circled our campsite from earlier, trailing in and out of the woods. "Someone's messing with us," I hissed, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. No one was supposed to be out here, miles from the nearest trailhead. The sky was nearly black when we stumbled into a clearing. An old wooden tower stood at its center, a fire lookout abandoned decades ago. Relief flooded me. At least it was some kind of shelter. We clambered up the rickety ladder, the wind howling as if protesting our intrusion. Inside, we barricaded the hatch and settled in, lighting our last lantern. The wind battered the tower, and the trees below swayed and groaned. Marco and I didn't speak. We barely breathed. Then, at the edge of the lantern's glow, I saw a face. It pressed against the dirty window, pale and featureless except for two dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The face melted away into the darkness, but I knew it was still out there, watching. Suddenly, something slammed against the hatch from below. Once, twice, each impact reverberating through the tower. Marco grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. Whatever was outside wasn't human. It clawed at the wood, hissing in a language I couldn't comprehend. "Don't look at it," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of the wind. "That's how it gets you. If you see it, it knows." The lantern flickered, and I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the voice that slithered into my mind. It was close now, crawling up the side of the tower. Boards creaked and groaned under its weight. Marco squeezed his eyes shut, and I followed suit, tears streaming down my face. Then, silence. The wind had stopped, and so had the thing below. I dared to open one eye. That's when I saw it. A pale hand, with elongated fingers, sliding through the gaps in the wooden boards. It found Marco's leg first. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound never came. He was yanked backward, disappearing through the broken boards, into the black maw of the forest. And I was alone. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the dying lantern, waiting for whatever had taken Marco to come back for me. But it didn't. Morning came, pale and cold. Rescue teams found me hours later, babbling about shadows and screams. They searched the woods for days, but they never found Marco. I still hear the whispers sometimes, echoing through the wind when I'm alone. And the face I saw that night, it's in my dreams, always watching, always waiting. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't go anywhere where the trees can whisper.